At 6:03 in the morning, Dominic Vale learned that the quietest woman in his empire had disappeared. He was standing at the window of his penthouse when the phone rang, the city still gray and wet below him, the harbor lights blinking out one by one as the sun came up over the water. He did not like phone calls at 6:03 in the morning. In his world, early calls meant blood or money or both. He answered on the second ring. "Boss." Marcus Reed's voice was tight, careful, the voice of a man who had learned exactly how much weight to put behind bad news. Nora Bell didn't clock in. Dominic said nothing for a moment. He turned the words over the way he turned over everything, slowly, looking for the trap in them. "She's never late," Marcus said when the silence stretched too long. 4 years. She's never been late once. Not for weather, not for the flu, not for anything. I called her twice. It went straight to voicemail both times. "Where are you?" Dominic said. It was not a question. It was an instruction disguised as one. Her apartment. "Boss." Marcus stopped, and in that pause, Dominic felt something cold move through his chest. An old and unfamiliar animal waking up after a long sleep. The door's forced. Place is torn apart. Her cat's still inside, hiding under the couch. She wouldn't leave that cat. Not for anything. Dominic's hand tightened around the coffee cup he was holding until the porcelain gave, until it shattered against the marble counter in 3 clean pieces, and he did not feel it cut his palm. He was already moving toward the door, already speaking, his voice dropping into the register that made grown men flinch. "Lock the city down," he said. "No trucks leave the docks, no boats move, no private flights take off from any strip we control, or any strip we can reach by phone call. Pull every camera between her building and the harbor. If anyone in this city knows where she is and keeps it from me, they will regret being born." Marcus, who had worked beside Dominic Vale for 11 years, who had watched him negotiate with men who wanted him dead and shake their hands afterward, without a flicker of feeling, had never once heard that particular note in his voice. It was not the sound of a boss who had lost an asset. It was the sound of a man who was afraid. To understand how the most dangerous man in the city ended up standing in a wrecked apartment at dawn, staring at an empty cat bowl like it was a crime scene photograph, you have to go back, 20 hours back, to a woman nobody in that building had ever really looked at, and a ledger that was about to get her killed. Vale Harbor Logistics occupied 4 floors of a converted brick warehouse 2 blocks from the water, glass and steel bolted onto old bones, the kind of building that looked respectable enough that nobody asked too many questions about the trucks that came and went at odd hours, or the shipping manifests that never quite added up if you looked closely enough. Nobody looked closely enough, except Nora Bell. She was 28 years old, soft-bodied and quiet, with honey-brown hair she kept pinned back in a hurry every morning, and glasses she was always pushing up her nose when she concentrated. She wore cardigans in every season, oversized and soft, the kind of clothes that made her feel like she was taking up less room in the world. She sat at a desk near the server room, in the corner where the light was worst and the foot traffic was lightest, and she had built her entire professional existence around being unremarkable. It was not modesty. It was armor. Nora had spent her whole life being told, in 1,000 small ways, that she was too much and not enough at the same time, too big, too soft, too quiet, too nervous, too easily overlooked to matter, and yet somehow always visible enough to be commented on. She had learned that the safest place to stand was in the corner, head down, making herself small enough that no one would bother finding a reason to make her feel smaller. At Vale Harbor Logistics, everyone understood, without ever saying it aloud, that the company was not entirely what it claimed to be. The shipping manifests were real. The customs paperwork was real. But underneath the real business ran another one, quieter and much more dangerous, and the people who worked on the upper floors did not ask questions about it. Nora didn't ask either. She just did the books. She was good at silence. And she was better than good at numbers. She could look at a spreadsheet the way other people looked at a familiar face, and know immediately when something about it was wrong. She thought Dominic Vale did not know her name. She was wrong. Dominic walked through the accounting floor perhaps twice a week, and every time he did, the temperature of the room seemed to drop, conversations dying mid-sentence, eyes dropping to keyboards. He was 35, dark-suited, moving with the unhurried economy of a man who had never once needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. People said he could end a career or a life with a single look, and mostly they were right. What none of them knew was that Dominic Vale had been quietly cataloging the details of Nora Bell's existence for 2 years. He knew she made her tea too strong and let it go cold before she remembered to drink it. He knew she stayed 40 minutes after everyone else left, most nights, working through numbers that were not technically her job to fix. He knew she was the only person on that floor who said good morning to the janitor and meant it, who had once spent her lunch break helping him carry a broken vacuum down 4 flights of stairs. He knew she flinched, almost imperceptibly, when certain men from the dock crews came through the office, and he had made sure, through channels she would never trace back to him, that those men learned to keep their distance from the accounting floor. He had raised her salary twice without her ever putting in a request. He told himself it was good business, keeping a sharp mind well paid. He told himself the same thing about the quiet instructions he'd given Marcus years ago to make sure nothing happened to the woman in the corner. He told himself a lot of things, because the truth was simpler and more dangerous than he wanted to admit. He had noticed everything about Nora Bell, and because he had noticed everything, he had decided to stay away. His world ate soft things alive. He had watched it happen more times than he could count. Decent people pulled too close to men like him and ground down into something unrecognizable. He believed, with the particular stubbornness of a man who has never been asked to examine his own logic, that distance was the kindest thing he could offer her. He did not yet understand that his silence would be the very thing that left her alone when it mattered most. It was raining the night Nora found it, the kind of steady autumn rain that turned the windows of the accounting floor into sheets of moving silver, blurring the harbor lights into long smears of gold and red. She was alone. Everyone else had gone home hours ago, and she liked the office best this way, empty enough that she could breathe, quiet enough that the numbers stopped competing with anything else for her attention. She had a reconciliation report open, checking dock service fees against a shell holding account called Mariner Trust, one of dozens of small entities the company used to manage cargo insurance and customs clearance. Something about the numbers felt wrong. Not wrong in an obvious way. Nothing screamed at her from the page. It was more like a stain, faint and spreading. The kind of thing you only notice if you have spent 4 years learning exactly what clean money looks like. She pulled up the cargo manifests. She cross-referenced them against dock service invoices, against customs clearance codes, against the offshore ledger entries that fed back into Mariner Trust. And there it was, small and patient and almost invisible, transfers broken into amounts just modest enough not to trigger review, siphoned out at regular intervals over the last 6 months. When she added them together, her hands went cold. $2.4 million. She traced the authorization trail and found a name she didn't recognize attached to the account. Elias Ward, a ghost, a paperman, existing only in the metadata of a shell company. But the access timestamps told a different story. The login pattern, the device signature, the hours of activity. She had seen those patterns before, on internal reports, attached to a real name, Victor Harlan. Nora sat very still for a long moment, listening to the rain against the glass, understanding with a clarity that made her stomach drop that one of the most trusted men in Dominic Vale's organization was stealing from him, and had been for months, and was very likely planning to use that money for something worse than theft. She thought about walking straight to Dominic's office. She thought about it. And then she thought about what would happen to her if she was wrong, or if she was right, and someone found out she'd gone looking before she had proof. Numbers didn't lie, but people did, and she had learned a long time ago that a quiet woman with an accusation and no evidence was very easy to discredit, and very easy to disappear. So she built the proof instead. She copied the real transfer logs. She copied the access timestamps, the device authorization keys, the cargo manifest mismatches, the backup authorization trail that tied every fraudulent transfer back to Victor's private credentials. She worked methodically, the fear a low hum under her concentration, until she had built a complete record onto a small secure drive, the kind of drive that could end a man's life if it fell into the right hands, or end hers if it fell into the wrong ones. And because some part of her understood, even then, that she might not get the chance to hand this to anyone in person, she set up something else. A delayed encrypted upload, timed to fire automatically to an internal audit address if she did not log back into her terminal by 7 the next morning. A dead man's switch, though she would never have called it that. Just insurance. Just a quiet woman's version of a loaded gun. She hid the drive where no one would think to look, soon into the inner seam of her cardigan, the soft, oversized, forgettable cardigan that had never once drawn a second glance from anyone in that building. She told herself she would decide what to do in the morning. She did not get a morning. She heard him before she saw him, the particular weight of a man's footsteps who has never once worried about who might be listening. Victor Harlan stood in the doorway of the accounting floor with 2 men behind him, and Nora understood immediately, from the stillness in his face, that he already knew. "Working late? Nora?" he said. His voice was pleasant in the way that only made it worse. She closed the folder on her screen too fast, and she watched his eyes track the movement, watched something in his expression settle into certainty. Later she would realize it was the reflection. The Mariner Trust folder had thrown its ghost onto the dark glass wall behind her, and he'd seen enough of it walking in. "That's the problem with quiet girls," Victor said, stepping into the room. "People forget they're listening." She tried to keep her voice steady. I don't know what you mean. Sure you do. He was closer now, and she could see, up close, the particular blankness in his eyes that she'd only ever seen in men who had already decided something was going to happen and were simply waiting for the room to catch up. You're going to tell me where you put it, the drive, the files, whatever you copied. And then this doesn't have to be difficult. She thought about running. There was nowhere to run. His men were already moving, one toward the door behind her, one toward her desk. I didn't copy anything, she said, and her voice cracked in the middle of the lie. And she knew he heard it crack. Nora. He said her name almost gently, which was somehow worse than if he'd shouted it. I've been doing this a long time. I know what a person looks like when they're telling the truth. You're not. She reached for her phone. A hand closed over her wrist before she'd moved 3 inches, and she twisted, and her glasses slid off and clattered to the floor, and the world went soft and blurred at the edges. She kicked her glasses case under the cabinet with the toe of her shoe, a small useless gesture, a breadcrumb she wasn't even sure would matter. And then a hand pressed something cold and chemical-smelling over her mouth and nose. And the last thing she thought, before the room folded in on itself, was, please let it activate. Please let it send. Then there was nothing. Back at 6:03 that morning, standing in the ruins of Nora's apartment, Dominic Vale understood immediately that whatever had happened here had not been a break-in gone wrong. The door had been forced with tools, not desperation. The apartment had been searched, not ransacked, drawers opened and closed, books pulled from shelves and set back imperfectly, the careful violence of men looking for something specific. And in the corner, hiding beneath the couch with her ears flat against her skull, was a small orange cat, alone, terrified, and very clearly not fed. Marcus watched Dominic crouch down slowly, watched him hold out one hand and wait, patient in a way Marcus had genuinely never seen from him, until the cat crept close enough to be gathered up against his chest. She wouldn't leave this cat, Dominic said quietly. Not for any reason, not if she had a choice. Boss, she's a bookkeeper, Marcus said, not unkindly, just trying to understand the size of the reaction he was witnessing. Maybe she panicked. Maybe she's hiding somewhere. No. Dominic stood, the cat still cradled against him, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. She is not just a bookkeeper. She is the only person in that building who could look at 6 months of shipping records and know exactly where the money was leaking. If someone took her, it's because she found something. And that means someone in my organization has been stealing from me long enough to be afraid of getting caught. The lockdown that followed moved through the city like weather. Trucks that had been idling at the loading docks, ready to roll out with the morning's shipments, were held at the gate on Dominic's order. Boat captains who answered to men who answered to Dominic found their engines mysteriously delayed. 2 private airstrips that had, on occasion, moved things, and people that customs never saw, were told nothing was leaving the ground until further notice. Traffic camera footage from 6 intersections near Nora's apartment was pulled and reviewed frame by frame. Men who owed favors to the Vale family were called and asked, in tones that made clear refusal was not an option, whether they'd seen anything, heard anything, moved anything unusual in the last 12 hours. Marcus had seen Dominic Vale go to war before. He had seen him dismantle rival operations with cold, surgical patience over months, never raising his voice, never showing his hand until the final piece was in place. He had never seen him move like this, fast, visible, unconcerned with subtlety, willing to let the entire city know that something precious to him had been taken. It did not take long for word to spread through the underworld that Dominic Vale was looking for a woman, and that he was not being careful about who knew it. Nora woke to cold and the smell of rust. Her wrists were bound to the arms of a metal chair, the rope cutting deep enough that her hands had gone numb somewhere in the hours she'd been unconscious. Without her glasses, the room existed as a blur of gray shapes. Freezer doors hanging open on rusted hinges, meat hooks swinging gently from an overhead rail, a single bare bulb far above her casting a small, swaying circle of yellow light. The air was damp and smelled of old blood and standing water, the particular decay of a building that had been abandoned by everything except its own memory. Her cheek throbbed. She didn't remember being hit, but she must have been at some point in the hours she'd lost. She moved her shoulders carefully, testing the rope, and felt the small, hard shape still sewn into the seam of her cardigan against her ribs. Still there, still hidden. Whatever else had gone wrong, they had not found it, and that meant it still mattered. She heard footsteps, and then Victor Harlan's face resolved out of the blur as he crouched in front of her, close enough that she could see the small scar along his jaw, the patience in his expression that frightened her far more than anger would have. "Let's try this again," he said. "Where is the drive?" "I don't have any drive." Her voice came out steadier than she expected, though her heart was slamming against her ribs. Victor sighed, almost sadly, and produced a folder, dropping a set of printed pages into her lap. She looked down at them, transfer records, timestamps, login credentials, all of it dressed up to look like proof that Nora Bell, quiet bookkeeper, had been the one skimming money from Mariner Trust. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "By tomorrow, everyone will believe you did this. A greedy little bookkeeper who thought no one would notice, and when they find your body somewhere convenient, it'll look like justice. Unless you give me the real files, and then maybe I let you disappear somewhere far away instead." Nora made herself look at the papers instead of at him, and something in her settled, the particular calm that only ever came to her in front of a spreadsheet. "This login was used at 2:14 in the morning 3 weeks ago," she said, her voice shaking but not stopping. "I was home. The building's own access logs will show I didn't badge in that night. And this backup authorization key." She made herself keep going, even as he leaned closer. Even as his expression darkened, that key was issued from a device that isn't mine. I know, because I helped set up device registration for senior staff 2 years ago. That key traces back to you. His hand cracked across her face before she finished the sentence, and her head snapped sideways, and for a moment the gray room went white and ringing. "Where," he said, very quietly now, "is the drive?" She spat blood onto the concrete floor and did not answer. "He's going to come for me," she said instead. Once she could speak again, and she was surprised to hear that it sounded less like a hope and more like a fact. "And when he does, you're going to wish you'd let me go." Victor smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. "He doesn't even know your name." She didn't answer that. She wasn't entirely sure it was untrue, but some small, stubborn part of her had decided, somewhere in the last several hours, that she would rather die not knowing than live having handed him what he wanted. It was the delayed upload that finally gave them the thread to pull. At 7:02 that morning, an automated audit package had fired from Nora's terminal to an internal compliance address. Nobody checked often enough. A partial record, incomplete but damning, tagged with a timestamp and a device signature that put her exactly where she'd said she would be. Marcus found it buried in the server logs an hour later, and it did two things at once. It confirmed that Nora had discovered something worth dying to protect, and it gave them a location to work backward from, because the signature on the file pointed to a lease Victor Harlan had quietly taken out 8 months earlier on an old meatpacking facility near the West Pier. Dominic did not wait for confirmation. He moved with 12 men through the gray morning light, black vests, and short, efficient weapons, the gates of the old warehouse complex crashing inward under the weight of 2 trucks before anyone inside had time to organize a real defense. Gunfire cracked somewhere near the loading bay. Men shouted orders that dissolved into chaos within seconds. Dominic walked through the smoke like it wasn't there. He found her in the back room, tied to a chair beneath a swinging bulb, her face bruised, her glasses gone, blood dried at the corner of her mouth, and something in his chest, something that had been cold and controlled for as long as he could remember, simply broke open. Nora. Her name came out of him wrong, not a command, not the voice that made rooms go silent, but a sound closer to a wound. He crossed the room and knelt in front of her, cutting the rope from her wrists with a blade that shook, very slightly, in his hand. "I didn't tell him where it was," she whispered, the words coming out cracked and urgent, as though that was the only thing that mattered, as though her own safety was secondary to making sure he knew she hadn't broken. "I know," he said. "You know?" Her eyes, blurred without her glasses, searched his face like she was trying to memorize it. "I know enough," he said, "and I should have known sooner." Victor's voice came from above them, echoing off the corrugated metal ceiling. He stood on the old catwalk that ran along the second level of the warehouse, a rifle steady in his hands, the fake transfer record still clutched in his other fist. He threw the papers down, and they scattered across the concrete like dead leaves. "The commission will believe her," Victor called down. "A quiet little bookkeeper who thought no one was watching. If she dies here, it'll look exactly like justice, Dominic. Nobody will ask questions." Dominic rose slowly, positioning himself between Victor's line of sight and the chair where Nora sat, and something in his stillness carried more menace than any amount of shouting could have. "Unlike you," Dominic said, "I know what loyalty looks like." Victor fired. Dominic moved without thinking, twisting his body to shield her, and the round caught him high in the shoulder, spinning him half around with the force of it. He did not go down. Marcus returned fire from the loading bay entrance, and Victor staggered back along the catwalk, dropping the rifle as he scrambled for the far stairwell and disappeared into the smoke and shouting beyond. Nora was already moving, her fingers clumsy with adrenaline and cold, working at the seam of her cardigan until the small drive came free in her palm. She pressed it into Dominic's hand, her voice shaking but clear. "Everything's on there," she said. "The real transfers, the access logs, the device key that ties back to him. He can run, but he can't erase this." Dominic looked down at the small piece of plastic and metal in his palm like she had just handed him a crown. "You saved my family," he said. "I was just doing the books." Her voice cracked on the last word, no. He said it with a certainty that left no room for her to argue. "You were doing what no one else in that building was smart enough to do." He asked her if she could stand, and she tried, and her legs gave out beneath her before she'd taken a full step, the pain and the hours of fear finally catching up to her body all at once. He caught her before she hit the ground, and she felt herself flush with a shame so old and so familiar it barely registered as new. "I'm sorry," she whispered, not looking at him. "I'm too heavy." Something in Dominic went very still and then very dark, not at her, but at the words themselves, at the years of quiet cruelty it must have taken to teach a woman to apologize for existing, in a moment when she had just risked her life to save his. "Do not," he said, his voice low and rough, "ever say that to me again." He lifted her anyway, despite the blood soaking through his shoulder. Despite the 12 men waiting for orders in the smoke behind them, and he carried her out of that warehouse like she weighed nothing at all, because in the only way that mattered to him in that moment, she didn't. "You are not too heavy," he told her, once they were outside, once the gray morning air hit her face and the rain had softened to mist. "You are here. You are alive. That is all I care about." She didn't have an answer for that. She simply let herself be carried, and let herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, take up exactly as much space as she needed to. Dominic did not take her to a hospital. Victor had friends in places that made hospitals dangerous, badges and white coats that could not entirely be trusted. And so instead he brought her to the penthouse safe house above the harbor, glass windows looking out over a city that did not yet know how close it had come to losing its balance of power. A private doctor treated the bruising along her ribs and the cut at the corner of her mouth. Another treated Dominic's shoulder, and he sat through it without complaint, his eyes on the closed door of the room where Nora slept, as though he could not quite convince himself she was safe unless he kept watching the door. When she woke, hours later, he was still there, sitting in a chair pulled close to the bed, his jacket gone, his shirt sleeve cut away above the bandage on his shoulder. "Victor?" she asked, before she'd even said anything else. "Found before dawn," Dominic said. "The drive did exactly what you built it to do. His collaborators are being questioned. The commission has the truth now, in writing, time-stamped, impossible to argue with." He paused. "You cleared your own name before anyone even had the chance to accuse you." "So it's over," she said, though it came out more like a question than she meant it to. "For him," Dominic said, "not for us." He did not tell her what had happened to Victor in the hours since the warehouse, and she did not ask. He understood, without being told, that she needed this room to be a place the darkness of his world didn't reach, at least for now, and he was careful to keep it that way. It was 2 days later, with the bruises fading and her glasses replaced, that Dominic finally said the things he had been carrying for 2 years. "I noticed you," he said, sitting across from her in the soft gray light of the penthouse, Marmalade curled asleep between them on the couch. "I noticed everything. The tea you let go cold. The way you helped the janitor with things that weren't your job. The way you hid in those cardigans like you were trying to take up less room in the world." Nora said nothing. watching him with an expression somewhere between disbelief and something more fragile. "I watched people overlook you," he went on, "and I let it happen because I told myself that if I stayed away, I was protecting you. My world ruins soft things, Nora. I've watched it happen more times than I can count. I thought distance was the kindest thing I could give you." "And now?" she asked quietly. "Now I understand that my silence just left you alone in a building full of wolves." He said it plainly, without excuse, the way a man says something he has already forgiven himself only partway for. "I should have known sooner. I should have been closer. I will not make that mistake again." "Why me?" she asked, and the question came out smaller than she meant it to, more honest than she'd planned. "You could have anyone. I'm not the kind of woman men like you want." "Then men like me have been fools," Dominic said, without hesitation. "Because you are real in a world built entirely out of lies. You are kind in a place that rewards cruelty. You see what everyone else misses. And even when you were afraid, especially when you were afraid, you told the truth. I have wanted you longer than I had any right to. I am done pretending otherwise." He did not reach for her. He did not push. He simply let the words sit in the space between them, and waited, with more patience than she had ever seen from a man who commanded entire docks with a single glance, for her to decide what she wanted to do with them. In the weeks that followed, Dominic gave Nora choices and made sure she understood, in ways both spoken and unspoken, that every one of them was real. She could leave Vale Harbor Logistics entirely, with more money than she would ever need, and a new life somewhere far from the harbor. She could stay under his protection without stepping back into the company at all. Or she could return, not to the corner desk near the server room, not to the life of quiet invisibility she had built for herself, but to something else entirely. She chose not to run. Dominic made the announcement himself, standing in front of the entire accounting floor on a gray Tuesday morning. Nora Bell was no longer a bookkeeper. She was director of internal financial security with her own office on the top floor, her own security detail, a direct line to Dominic that no capo, no manager, no one beneath him could override. Every audit flag she raised would be investigated. Every account she questioned would be opened for review. She answered to no one but the truth, and to the man who had finally learned to stand beside her instead of at a careful distance. People who had walked past her desk for 4 years without a glance now stood a little straighter when she entered a room. That evening, in the penthouse, Marmalade sank her teeth into Marcus Reed's ankle with what could only be described as vindictive satisfaction, and Dominic laughed. A real laugh, rare and unguarded, for the first time in longer than anyone in that building could remember. Later, when the apartment was quiet and the cat had settled into a patch of evening sun on the windowsill, Dominic asked her to dinner. Not as her boss, not as the man who had carried her out of a warehouse with a bullet in his shoulder. Just a man asking a woman if she would let him take her somewhere with candlelight and no ledgers and no danger at all. She said yes, softly, and meant it. For years, Nora Bell had been the quiet woman in the corner. The bookkeeper no one bothered to see. But numbers had always told her the truth, even when no one else was listening. And when the most dangerous man in the city finally learned to listen too, she did more than save his empire. She stopped apologizing for the space she took inside it.